Today we are looking at a case from the first part of the 19th century. So sit back as we go to England. Mary Ann Williams was born in the year 1805 in the beautiful English town of Ross-on-Wye. At the time of her birth, the town was known simply as Ross. The on-Wye part was not added until 1931, so as not to confuse Ross with other towns and places with a similar name. It was a nice place to grow up, situated on a river and close to the border with Wales. Mary Ann was not born into a wealthy family and was sent to work at a young age. Like many girls, she entered domestic service. The beginning of the 18th century was a difficult period for Britain. Between 1803 and 1815, the country was at war with the First French Empire, led by General Napoleon. The British hoped that the war would end the French domination of continental Europe. But as it dragged on, it meant that the British government had to increase the size of both the army and the navy and construct land defences on the south coast of England. In order to fund this, they raised taxes. They also had to impose trade restrictions, which resulted in higher unemployment and a dramatic increase in food prices. In addition to the economic hardship, most of the people had to suffer with poor and overcrowded housing, low wages, and the threat of disease such as smallpox, typhus, yellow fever and scarlet fever. It was estimated that in the early 1800s, over 400,000 people died each year in Europe from smallpox alone. Mary Ann did not have very much of an education. At the start of the 19th century, only a small number of children received any schooling, and education was mainly a privilege that was restricted to the upper classes, although some charity schools had been established. In 1820, when Mary Ann was 15 years old, more than 50% of the population was illiterate. By the time Mary Ann had reached her late teens, she had moved from the picturesque town of her birth to the city of Bristol. Bristol was far bigger than Ross, with a population of over 70,000. The city had grown due to its position on the banks of the River Avon, very close to the border with Wales. It was a place that offered many work opportunities. New industries had developed, and the city had also become very well known for trade and commerce. However, Bristol had the unenviable reputation of being a port city that was heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. This continued until the Slave Trade Abolition Act was passed in March of 1807. Mary Ann found domestic work in the house of a gentleman named Mr. Plumley. At first she worked hard, but as time passed, she became more idle. On occasions, Mr. Plumley had to speak to her about her alleged improper behaviour. He told her that he did not want to have shame associated with his household. Eventually he dismissed her, accusing her of stealing from him. She met and married a young man who worked as a tailor named Charles Agar, but this marriage did not last, and he soon abandoned her. Life then suddenly became difficult for Mary Ann. She'd only ever worked in domestic service and had never stayed in any household for very long. Most positions required references, and now her husband had left her. Although it seemed that the situation in which she now found herself was very bad, things improved when she met another gentleman who worked as a wine merchant. Unfortunately, this relationship ended after a few months, and again, she found herself in very difficult circumstances. Eventually, Mary Ann met a man named Mr. Charles Wade. He kept a lodging house at 17 Trinity Street, in the St. Philip's area of the city. She soon moved in with him, and although they did not marry, she started to present herself as Mrs. Wade. It was a happy union, and over the next few years she gave birth to 2 children. Lodging houses were popular in Bristol in the first part of the 19th century, especially amongst the young men who had arrived looking for work and who were in need of cheap accommodation. There was usually 3 or 4 people in the same room, and not only were they overcrowded, but they were not protected by any legislation. This meant that some were kept in very impoverished conditions, and no registers were kept with the names of people who were staying there. Mary Ann's lodging house was quite a success. Despite her lack of education and failure to keep any positions where she had been employed for very long, she ran the lodging house well. She looked after all the guests and made sure that everyone paid her in a timely manner. But these establishments were cheap, and although Mary Ann and Mr. Charles Wade were able to make enough money to live, they were still considered to be poor. It was a difficult period. Britain was transforming into a country of industrialisation, and as many more workers migrated from the country to the large industrial cities, there were protests against the government. In 1831, riots took place in Bristol, after the House of Lords rejected the Second Reform Bill, which was designed to give Britain's fast-growing industrial towns, such as Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham, Bradford and Leeds, a greater representation in Parliament. Bristol had been represented in the House of Commons since 1295, but by 1830, only 6,000 of the 104,000 population had the right to vote. The riots lasted for 3 days, in which time 4 rioters were killed and 86 were wounded. However, it is believed that the actual number who died could have been much higher. In September 1833, a widow named Mrs. Clara Smith took up residence in the lodging house. Her husband had worked as an ironmonger, and there were rumours that he had left her in very good financial circumstances. She paid for her own room. She was not prepared to share, and as she had no confidence in the financial institutions, she kept all of her money locked away in a tin box. Mary Ann was very attentive towards Mrs. Smith. She even hired a servant girl to look after her, named Miss Mary Allen, and she would always go out of her way to make sure that she was well and that everything was to her liking. However, on the 26th of October 1833, Mrs. Clara Smith was suddenly taken ill. She was suffering from terrible stomach pains. Mary Ann and the maid did their best to help, but soon after, the elderly lady died. There were no suspicious circumstances surrounding the death. After all, the average life expectancy at the time was around 42 years old. Mary Ann called for the undertaker, a gentleman named Mr. Thompson. She informed him that an elderly resident at her lodging house had died. She also said that the deceased was poor and had no friends or relatives, so must be buried with as little expense as possible. Miss Clara Smith was later buried at the St. Augustine's churchyard. Over the next few months, people started to notice that Mary Ann and Mr. Charles Wade seemed to be enjoying very good circumstances. Mary Ann told anyone that inquired that a rich uncle had died and had left her a large house. The couple paid off their debts and bought stock, but just 6 months after Mrs. Smith had so mysteriously died, Mr. Charles Wade also passed away. Mary Ann was now a wealthy woman, and she caught the attention of a gentleman named Mr. Paul Burdock. He proposed, and soon they were married. Mary Ann was now Mrs. Mary Ann Burdock. It was unclear why Mary Ann had agreed to marry Mr. Burdock, as she was still married to Mr. Charles Agar, and she would have known that it was illegal to have done so. In fact, entering into a marriage with one person while still married to another was a capital offence at the time, governed by the Bigamy Act of 1604, and was punishable by death. Mary Ann continued to live well, although people still questioned her great change in fortune. It was not until December 1834, 14 months after the death of Mrs. Clara Smith, that her relatives heard news of her death and travelled to Bristol. They were anxious to know the fate of the old lady's money and property. They became suspicious when they heard that Clara had apparently died in very poor circumstances. They knew that this could not be correct, as she had previously had a considerable amount of money, which she always kept in a tin box. They decided to report their suspicions to the police. The police had already investigated the death of Mrs. Smith and had spoken to Mary Ann. She had given them everything they had requested, and they had concluded that nothing untoward had taken place. However, as they were now told that Mrs. Smith had been a wealthy woman, and that Mary Ann had suddenly and quite unexpectedly come into money, they decided to exhume Mrs. Smith's body. On the 22nd of December 1834, the body of Mrs. Clara Smith was removed from its resting place, so an autopsy could be conducted. The operation was led by Dr. Riley, a physician at the Bristol Infirmary, and he was assisted by 2 other doctors, named Dr. Kelson and Dr. Simmons. Somewhat surprisingly, when the body was presented to them, they discovered that it was in a very good state of preservation and had not decomposed very much at all. The doctors first removed the stomach and observed that it contained a yellow substance, which they instantly recognised to be arsenic. However, they had to be sure, so they sent the stomach to the Bristol Medical School to be further examined by a chemistry lecturer named Mr. Herapath. After conducting various tests, he confirmed that the yellow substance was indeed arsenic. The police now believe that the death of Mrs. Clara Smith may have been caused by something more sinister. They interviewed the young girl servant, Miss Mary Allen, who had been employed to attend Mrs. Smith. She informed the constable that she had witnessed Mrs. Mary Ann Burdock adding a strange yellow powder to a bowl of gruel that she had prepared for the deceased. She said that shortly after eating it, Mrs. Smith became quite ill and died. She also said that following the death, Mary Ann had told her never to speak of Mrs. Smith, not who she was or what she was, and to never say that she had lived in the lodging house. In fact, she said that Mary Ann told her that if anyone asked about the old lady, to just say that she was a stranger and a foreigner from far away in the East Indies. She also said that Mary Ann insisted that she must never tell anyone that she had seen her put anything into the gruel. Mrs. Mary Ann Burdock was then arrested and charged with the murder of Mrs. Clara Smith. Her trial began on the 10th of April 1835 and took place at Bristol's Guildhall before Sir Charles Wetherell, a hardline anti-reformist who 4 years prior, on the 29th of October 1831, travelled to Bristol to open the assizes. At the time he was the recorder and had disregarded warnings that his presence may bring disturbances. It was his appearance that started the riots and the attack on the Mansion House, from which he was considered fortunate to have escaped. The riots continued for 3 days and many buildings were burnt and destroyed. The prosecution was represented by Mr. Smith, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Cook, 3 well-known and very capable lawyers, while the defence was led by Mr. Payne with the assistance of a Mr. Stone. The evidence was circumstantial, but the prosecution presented a very logical case. They told the court that the deceased, Mrs. Clara Smith, had taken a room in the lodging house of the accused, Mrs. Mary Ann Burdock, in September 1833, and at the time had on her possession a considerable amount of money. They informed the court that the deceased had no children, but had a brother-in-law who resided in the Portuguese city of Porto and a nephew who lived in England. They said that following Mrs. Clara Smith's most unfortunate death, the defendant had arranged for a very cheap and quick funeral, telling everyone that the old lady had died in her lodging house, without having any family or friends. Following the funeral, the circumstances in which Mrs. Burdock had previously lived dramatically changed, and she now started to present herself to be a person of considerable wealth. The witnesses for the prosecution included the young servant girl, Miss Mary Allen, and a gentleman named Mr. Evans. He had been a lodger at the defendant's lodging house and was residing there when Mrs. Smith had died. He told the court that 6 days before Mrs. Smith became ill, he had purchased arsenic on the request of Mrs. Burdock. She told him that she needed it to kill rats that she had seen in the kitchen. He said that he had never seen any rats in the house. Miss Mary Allen also told the court that she too had never seen any rats in the establishment. Mr. Evans said that when he purchased the arsenic, he did so in front of 2 witnesses. The prosecution presented both to the court, and they confirmed what Mr. Evans said to be true. He also said that in the evening of the day that the old lady had died, he heard the defendant and her late husband, Mr. Wade, laughing. Mr. Charles Reed, a gentleman who knew the deceased brother-in-law in Porto, told the court that in the November following Mrs. Smith's death, he went to the defendant's lodging house, where he saw her and Mr. Wade. He said that he made inquiries as to Mrs. Smith's property, money and bonds, to which Mrs. Burdock replied that the old lady had died very poor and that her clothes were in such a bad condition that she was compelled to burn them. Mr. Reed went on to say that Mrs. Burdock then said that she would not produce anything that had belonged to Mrs. Smith unless the funeral expenses were paid. He told the court that he returned the following morning and was presented with a box which contained some papers belonging to the deceased. In it was the will of Mr. Smith in favour of his wife. There were no property deeds, bonds or money. Mr. Reed added that since the death of her husband 5 years prior, Mrs. Smith had always dressed in a very respectful manner, and he knew that at the time of her death that she was a lady of considerable wealth. The proceedings lasted for 3 days, and before they were concluded, on Monday the 13th of April 1835, the defence presented witnesses who could vouch for Mary Ann's good character, and Mary Ann herself strongly protested her innocence. Before sending the jury out to deliberate, the judge turned to them and said, "The prisoner was charged with having murdered, by means of poison, a lady of the name of Mrs. Clara Smith. The poison being yellow arsenic, mixed in gruel. You will have to make up your minds upon the following 3 points. First, whether Mrs. Smith's death was occasioned by poison. Secondly, whether the poisoning was carried into effect by the prisoner. And thirdly, whether Mrs. Burdock knew that she was poisoning Mrs. Smith. If you're of the opinion that she did administer the poison, knowing it was poison, then you are bound to pronounce her guilty. As the jury deliberated, there was much noise in the court as the excited crowd shouted their opinion as to which way the verdict should go. But during this time, Mary Ann remained very calm and composed. 15 minutes later, the jury returned to find Mary Ann Burdock guilty of murder, and the judge sentenced her to death. When she left the court, she was greeted by a large crowd who shouted and screamed at her as she was transported back to prison. 2 days later, on Wednesday the 15th of April, in front of a crowd estimated to be in excess of 50,000, Mary Ann Burdock was hanged. She never confessed to the crime. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case